So wind power has a couple of problems. It only works when the wind is blowing. And we also have an issue with transmitting wind power. And apparently we throw, waste, do whatever you do with extra wind power that you can't use. And I'd like to address all three of those issues, but let's start with the transmission lines, because you brought up transmission infrastructure earlier. So if we have a whole bunch of wind power, do we have the transmission lines to move it?
The short answer is no. We have pretty much used up the existing capacity on our high voltage transmission system. To move bigger quantities of wind, or any power for that matter, we really need investment in our backbone grid. And that's happening. There's a program called CapEx 2020 where we're putting some 700 miles of transmission lines to connect with the neighboring states, not just to reinforce our existing backbone and help with our reliability situation today, but allow more wind power onto the grid and more power from out of state. So the existing grid is pretty much full to capacity of existing projects. To meet that 25 by 25, we will need to complete the CapEx projects. We will need to build additional transmission capacity, because right now the grid is full.
And the cost of CapEx is about $2 billion?
Approximately. It depends on what you include in it, but $1.5 to $2 billion are the numbers usually thrown out.
And the transmission lines run where?
Well, there's several. There's one that runs from the Fargo area to approximately St. Cloud, another one that will run from South Dakota into Wisconsin, and a couple of other projects, one in northern Minnesota and another one in the southern tier of the state.
So now we have the wind power, the extra wind power. What do we do with that?
Well, it's been a problem. We've had situations where we have to, quote, dump wind, where there's more wind on the grid that can be consumed by the demand at that time. The wind often blows at times we don't really need it. It's very windy.
Like at night?
At night, or on the weekends, or in the spring and in the fall when electric loads, because of seasonality or time of day reasons, are down. And so what has happened, we've had to either dump it from the grid, shut down wind machines, or oddly enough, back down cheap coal and nuclear resources to accommodate the amount of wind that volunteers to show up at any given point in time. It's not as controllable, or in the industry jargon, not as dispatchable as a natural gas plant or a coal-fired power plant.
So if we didn't have to meet the 25 by 25 standards, would we still be building CapEx?
We would. The program got started as a reliability program. What we needed to have in place in terms of transmission facilities to meet our reliability requirements for the year 2020. That was how the program got started. Now, as we've moved along, it's been expanded somewhat, but also tailored to allowing more wind power and more power onto the grid from other sources.
I am not a fan of wind, and I agree with you. There's a place for every different form of alternative energy. The more the merrier. Bring them all onto the market, because I am a free market kind of person. But there's a lot of property rights issues with the windmills, and in particular down in Goodhue County right now. And they are trying so hard to stop that wind farm. Are you hearing about more resistance to the wind farms?
Well, there is. A lot of the early projects were built in parts of the state that are sparsely populated and have traditionally been built on property owned by participants in the project, farmers who are also owners of the project. So it hasn't had the pushback. But as projects have had to look for space in more populated areas, there are more landowners involved, many of whom aren't participants in the project, and that's where a lot of the pushback has been. And so what I try to advocate working for the government, and have been advocating since, is more local control. We like these facilities, maybe some of us more than others, but we like these facilities, but we want them to be located in communities that accept them, that want them.
Right.
So let's have communities have more local control. So where communities want them, we're able to build them. We don't have rules that are one size fits all, but communities that aren't willing to be host or have more concerns, that those concerns are addressed. Much more of a bottom-up than a top-down approach.
Yeah, that's a great point. I know down in Goodhue County, Minnesota has a law in the books that says the setbacks for the windmills should be X. But the local entities can come in and make different setback distances if the community prefers. So for example, in Goodhue County, the windmill came in and they said, we want a 500-foot setback. Well, the landowner said, no, we want a 1,000-foot setback. And now they're butting heads over where this setback is going to be. Who do you think's going to win?
Well, I hope the communities win.
Me
I hope
too.
that's the result at the end. We actually don't have a law saying how much the setback should be.
Correct.
Which I would like to keep so we don't have a one-size-fits-all. So
Because we want the local communities to make that decision.
Exactly.
Yes.
And we have a law now which is less than clear about when communities can weigh in and how much weight is given to the preferences of communities. And we've been doing things on very much a case-by-case basis. And we've been fairly successful so far in making sure that local conditions and local permit restrictions match the community in which the facilities will be placed. I hope we'll continue that in the future. I would like to see more control and more influence given by the local communities and less by just the state dictating what the outcome should be.
So just recently, I want to say St. Paul, but I could be wrong on which city approved it. They approved an urban windmill, a little tiny version of a windmill that can go in somebody's house. And some of the neighbors are a little bit leery about it, but they're willing to say, hey, let's give it a try. Maybe it'll work. Have you heard of it?
I have. There's all kinds of different technologies out there that aren't the propeller on top of a tall pole, some that look more like egg beaters and some other wacky shapes. Urban winds is difficult to do for technical reasons because of turbulence and the amount of height you need to put a tower. Doesn't always fit well in an urban setting, but I'm very much for experimentation. Let's let people, consumers, landowners try different things as long as they're not impinging on their neighbors. And who knows, we might discover a technology, we might discover an approach that will work, that will produce clean power at a reasonable price while maintaining reliability.
Let's talk coal. What do you think?
Well, it's the power source that we rely on for anywhere from 50 to 60% of our power. We can't get rid of it without creating huge problems for our economy and for reliability. So it's here to stay. Now, that's not to say we can't do things to improve its environmental performance, to improve its economic performance, but we can't just shut it down overnight. That would create catastrophe. But we do rely heavily on it, especially in the Midwest. But here in Minnesota, it's 50 to 60% of our total electricity amounts come from coal, and much of it from out of state.
Primarily North Dakota.
North Dakota, but also South Dakota and other places as well. So we really need, in being an energy dependent state that we are, we only produce about 3/4 to 80% of the power we consume in Minnesota. So we import quite a bit of our power, whether it's from hydroelectric projects in Manitoba or on the Missouri River, or whether it's coal from North and South Dakota. We rely a little bit on the kindness of strangers. So we need to be careful on how we get along well with others, but also in maintaining those strong ties and that infrastructure, because we're going to be reliant on coal for decades to come.
Okay, one of the things that I remember just ripping the Pawlenty administration apart on my radio show was sequestering carbon. What do you think about that?
Well, that technology, it's been some interesting experiments tried. You mentioned North Dakota. They actually have a facility that sequesters carbon from a plant.
Will you explain to the viewers what sequestering carbon means?
Well, one of the outputs of an electric generating facility, whether it's coal or natural gas, is carbon dioxide, one of the so-called greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide, if you instead of discharging it in the atmosphere, if you want to do something else with it, such as putting it into the ground, you need to capture it from the exhaust stack, if you will, and putting it in a pipe and moving it somewhere. And in fact, in North Dakota, they're moving it to Saskatchewan, where it's being used, pumped into the ground to enhance the performance of oil wells in Saskatchewan. So it's a win-win. We get better.
And Saskatchewan's saying, thank you, suckers.
Well, they're happy. It's a small-scale experiment, but it's an interesting one, but it's not one that's ready for prime time. We don't have commercial-scale projects that would allow us to retrofit large coal plants and do this. And it's not clear that if we were to do it, it would be a permanent solution. And it's not clear if it were a permanent solution whether it would make a difference to whatever it is whatever environmental problem you're trying to solve.
And only government would think sequestering CO2 to spend a couple $1 million on it every year for 4 or 5 years in this pilot program would be a good idea. That's an example of not having competition work.
Well, it's an example of a mandate, an example of somebody deciding what the solution should be. But I gave you the example of the oil field. Well, there's a win-win. If we can find solutions like that, then there's going to be a market developing around that. If oil fields find that pumping CO2 in the ground produces more oil at a better price, then they'll be willing to partner with coal-fired power plants. But there would be an example of the market working, as opposed to a government mandate that says we're going to spend billions of dollars to build a pipeline from here to there and hoping that's the right solution, guessing it's the right solution, but not really knowing.
You mentioned hydroelectric.